My neighbor whispered, "I want you closer, much closer." And just like that, everything changed. The evening was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Our apartment building had that soft, lived-in silence that only comes after most people have gone to bed. I was locking my door when I noticed her. My neighbor, a woman I'd known by sight for months but never really spoken to. She was coming down the hallway, carrying a couple of grocery bags, and there was a subtle grace in the way she moved, even under the weight of her load. I offered to help almost without thinking. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, enough for me to catch the delicate arch of her eyebrow, a hint of surprise in her eyes. When our hands met over the bag handles, it wasn't just a simple brush. It lingered, warm and electric, like the air itself had shifted. I pulled my hand back, a little flustered, but she held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and I felt that strange pull of curiosity, of fascination. She smiled, that effortless, quiet kind of smile that doesn't need words to make an impact. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, calm, and just a little husky from a long day. It wasn't flirtation, at least not in the obvious way, but there was something in the cadence, the way she looked at me, that made my stomach tighten slightly. We walked the rest of the hallway together, her pace measured, my thoughts racing. I tried to make small talk, casual comments about the weather, the elevator, how late it was, but the words felt hollow compared to the quiet charge between us. Every small movement she made seemed intentional. The way her fingers brushed a stray strand of hair, the subtle tilt of her head when she listened. There was a depth there, a life experience in her eyes that contrasted sharply with my own tentative youth. When we reached her door, she leaned casually against the frame, bags resting on the floor beside her. "I like having you around," she said, almost in passing, but the words hung between us like a delicate spark. It was brief, and yet it carried weight, a suggestion that maybe our interactions were more than mere neighborly politeness. I nodded, unsure how to respond. My heart was doing something it hadn't done in a long time, that nervous, anticipatory flutter you get when you realize someone might see you in a way no one else does. She laughed softly, almost to herself, and stepped inside, closing the door with a quiet click. I stayed in the hallway longer than I should have, replaying the moment over and over in my head. There was something in her gaze, in the calm confidence of her movements, that made the ordinary feel charged, almost electric. For the first time, I noticed the subtle elegance in the way she carried herself, the warmth that seemed to radiate from her without effort, the slight vulnerability she only let show when she thought no one was paying attention. And just like that, the simple act of carrying groceries together had shifted everything. I realized I wasn't just curious about her anymore. I wanted to know her, truly know her, and that realization both excited and unnerved me. Something was beginning, something slow and quietly dangerous to my heart, and I had no idea where it would lead. The next morning, the building felt softer somehow, as if the sunlight filtering through the windows had found a new warmth. I was heading out to grab coffee when I noticed her in the hallway. Hair loosely tied, eyes still a little puffy from sleep, she clutched a steaming mug as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She looked real, not the composed, distant neighbor from before, but someone human, someone quietly vulnerable. "Morning," I said, trying to sound casual. My voice felt small in the vast, silent corridor. She gave a half-smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes at first glance but leaves a lingering warmth behind. "Not a morning person," she admitted, with a laugh that seemed too gentle for the space between us. There was an honesty there, a rare glimpse into the life she usually kept tightly under wraps. I found myself drawn to it. "Coffee?" she offered suddenly, as if on impulse, holding out the mug like it was a peace offering. Then she added almost shyly, "Come in, just for a minute." Her apartment smelled faintly of jasmine and something warm, vanilla, maybe, or the lingering aroma of yesterday's cooking. The light from the kitchen window caught dust motes floating lazily through the air, creating a golden haze that made the room feel suspended in time. She poured coffee into 2 mugs, and when she handed me one, our fingers brushed again. It was fleeting, yet deliberate enough that my pulse skipped. We sat close on the couch, knees nearly touching, and she asked about my work, my mornings, things I'd never thought to share with a neighbor. But she didn't just ask. She listened. Really listened. Her eyes softened whenever I talked about something I was proud of. And when I mentioned moments of frustration, she nodded as if she understood every unspoken feeling behind the words. At one point, I laughed at a story, and she laughed too. A quiet, melodic sound that filled the room without demanding attention. Her hand reached out, almost instinctively, and brushed a crease from my shirt collar. The warmth of her fingertips lingered on my skin longer than necessary, and I caught myself staring at her, captivated by the subtle intimacy of the gesture. She pulled her hand back quickly, a small, almost imperceptible flush rising to her cheeks, and I felt a quiet thrill. It was the kind of tension that doesn't need words, where every glance, every touch, every breath carries meaning. I realized that our ordinary neighborly interaction was slowly, imperceptibly, tipping into something else, something charged, delicate, and dangerously enticing. When I finally left, stepping back into the bright hallway, I caught her watching me, leaning slightly against the doorframe as if she wanted me to stay longer. Her smile lingered, and I could feel the weight of unspoken words hovering between us. For the first time, our connection felt intentional, magnetic, the kind of slow, building pull that makes every subsequent encounter feel heavier, warmer, and infinitely more complicated. And just like that, a simple coffee break had shifted the rhythm of our mornings. I couldn't tell if I was more excited or more terrified by it, but one thing was certain. I didn't want this closeness to end. It was an unusually heavy rain that evening, the kind that made the streets glisten under the dim glow of the streetlights. I was tucked into my apartment, half reading, half listening to the steady rhythm of droplets against the window, when I heard a faint knock at my door. My heart skipped a beat. It was her. She stood in the hallway, candlelight flickering behind her like a halo, holding it in one hand as though it could shield her from the storm. Her hair had come loose from its usual tidy tie, framing her face softly, and there was a hesitancy in her posture that made her seem smaller, almost fragile. "The power's out. Can I maybe come in for a minute?" she asked, her voice low and careful. Of course, I said yes. I led her inside, and we sat cross-legged on the living room floor, flashlights casting gentle halos around us. The apartment was filled with the quiet hum of our shared space, the rain drumming a soft rhythm against the windows. For the first time, it didn't feel like an ordinary neighborly visit. It felt like stepping into a secret world, a private corner away from everything else. She began to talk about work, about the endless demands that left her exhausted yet unwilling to let anyone see the strain, about the loneliness she felt even when surrounded by people, about the invisible weight she carried as someone expected to be composed, confident, always together. Her words were careful but unguarded, like she was revealing something she had kept hidden for years. I listened as I always did, but this time there was more than curiosity. I reached out almost instinctively to touch her arm lightly, just a grounding gesture. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand rested briefly over mine, warm and trembling ever so slightly, as though testing the water. There was a quiet intimacy in that simple touch, a sense of shared vulnerability that neither of us could ignore. We spoke softly, sometimes pausing just to hear the rain, to let the silence stretch comfortably between us. She told me she hadn't allowed anyone this close in a long time, that she had trained herself to shoulder her burdens alone. And yet, here she was, letting me in, letting someone see her as she truly was. At one point, a particularly loud clap of thunder startled her, and she instinctively pressed her hand against my arm. I felt the small tremor, the subtle hesitation, and held her gently, careful not to break the delicate balance of trust forming between us. She looked up at me then, eyes glimmering in the flickering candlelight, and I saw a mixture of relief and surprise. Relief that someone could understand, surprise that someone would care. The night stretched on, but time seemed suspended, measured not in minutes but in heartbeats, in the quiet rise and fall of breath, in the brush of fingers over skin. By the time the rain eased, something had shifted irrevocably. The casual neighborly acquaintance had transformed into a fragile, precious connection, delicate but undeniably real. When she finally left, stepping back into the wet night, she paused at her door, glanced at me and smiled softly. A smile that carried gratitude, longing, and something unspoken that neither of us was ready to name. And I knew, in that quiet, rain-drenched moment, that the distance between us had begun to disappear. A week had passed since that rainy night, but the memory of her words and the warmth of her presence lingered with me constantly. It was one of those evenings where the sun was dipping behind the city skyline, painting the hallway outside our apartments in soft amber light. I was heading to my door when I heard the familiar shuffle of her footsteps behind me. She was carrying a large box, something heavy and awkward, and immediately, I stepped forward. "Here, let me help," I said instinctively. She glanced at me with that small, quiet smile that had begun to haunt my thoughts. "Thanks. I don't know what I was thinking," she said, laughter soft but tinged with fatigue. As I steadied her, our hands met over the box. This time, there was no hesitation, no accidental brush, just a firm, necessary touch. When she stumbled slightly, I caught her by the waist, careful, steady, and instinctively protective. She froze, as if surprised by the closeness, but her body didn't pull away. She simply leaned into the contact for a heartbeat longer than expected, her breath warm against my chest. For a moment, neither of us moved. The ordinary world seemed to dissolve around us. The distant hum of the city, the soft glow of the hallway lights, the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the evening air. Everything felt suspended. I could feel the rhythm of her heartbeat through the thin fabric of her shirt, subtle but insistent, and I realized she could feel mine too. She pulled back first, lightly brushing her hands along her sides as if to remind herself that she could control the moment. Her eyes met mine, a mixture of amusement and something softer, something hesitant but deeply curious. She laughed lightly, a small melodic sound that made the hallway feel warmer, even in the dim light. "You're making this way more dramatic than it needs to be," she said, but her cheeks had a faint flush, and her fingers lingered near mine before she let them drop. We carried the box together a few more steps, each movement loaded with attention that neither of us wanted to name aloud. Every glance, every small accidental brush of hands, every shared breath seemed to hum with a new kind of awareness, a slow, deliberate acknowledgement that the boundaries between us were shifting. When we finally set the box down, she leaned against the wall, smoothing her hair back from her face. I don't usually let people help me with this kind of thing," she admitted quietly, almost in a whisper. Her vulnerability, so rare and fleeting, pulled at something inside me. The instinct to protect, to reassure, to be closer. I smiled softly, stepping back just enough to give her space, though my presence still lingered. "I'm glad you let me," I said. There was honesty in my voice, a careful sincerity that I hoped would reach her. She looked at me then, really looked, as if weighing the consequences of closeness. And in that look, I sensed it, the first unspoken acknowledgement that what we were sharing had already begun to mean something more than simple neighborly kindness. The line between neighbors and something else was no longer clear, and neither of us wanted to cross it just yet, but both of us felt the pull. That night, as I returned to my apartment, the memory of her warmth against me and the subtle thrill of proximity stayed with me, a quiet reminder that our lives were quietly, irrevocably intertwining. The building was silent that night, almost reverent, as if it too were holding its breath. I had been lost in thought, replaying every moment we had shared over the past week. Every brush of hands, every fleeting glance, every quiet laugh. When there was a soft knock at my door, my pulse skipped. I opened it to find her standing there, candlelight from her apartment spilling into the hallway and framing her in a warm, golden glow. Her hair was loose, falling in soft waves around her face, slightly damp from the drizzle that had started again. She looked at me with that careful, intense gaze, the one that made me feel simultaneously exposed and grounded. "Can we talk?" she asked softly, her voice low, almost trembling. I stepped aside wordlessly, letting her in. We moved to the small hallway outside my apartment, where the warm overhead light gave everything a golden softness. Neither of us spoke at first. The air between us was thick with anticipation, each heartbeat amplified in the quiet corridor. Then she exhaled, a breath that carried a lifetime of hesitation and restraint. I've been avoiding this, she began, her eyes flickering away for just a moment. Because I feel something I didn't expect, something that scares me. I took a step closer, careful, my voice steady. You don't have to be scared with me. Whatever it is, I want to understand it. Her gaze returned to mine, softening but burning with quiet intensity. She shifted slightly, closing the gap between us until the warmth of her presence pressed gently against my chest. I could feel her breath brush mine. Subtle, intimate, yet innocent. I want you closer, she said finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. Then, almost as if admitting it to herself as much as to me, she added, much closer. The words hung in the air like a fragile thread, vibrating with desire and vulnerability. There was no demand in them, no pressure. Only a confession, raw and trembling. A truth she had carried silently for too long. My chest tightened at the honesty, at the trust she had placed in me by saying it aloud. I lifted a hand slowly, trembling slightly, and brushed a strand of hair from her face, tucking it behind her ear. She closed her eyes briefly at the touch, leaning in just a fraction, trusting me in the way she hadn't trusted anyone in years. My fingertips lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary, savoring the moment without pushing, without rushing. Her hands found my arms instinctively, holding on lightly, grounding herself in the small, careful closeness we had created. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, close enough to feel warmth, but distant enough to preserve the delicate tension that made the moment electric. When she finally opened her eyes, there was a flicker of relief, of anticipation, and maybe even a quiet joy. The confession had been made, and with it, the invisible wall between us had begun to crumble. The hallway was still silent, the world outside the building oblivious to the small, powerful shift that had just occurred. But for the first time, I knew we were no longer merely neighbors. Something else had begun, and neither of us could pretend otherwise. The night felt unusually still, almost suspended in time. I found her waiting for me near the door to my apartment, the faint glow of a hallway light casting soft shadows across her face. She looked at me with a mix of anticipation and hesitation, and for a moment, the world outside the building seemed to fade completely. We didn't speak immediately. There was no need. Something unspoken hung between us, a tension that was both electric and delicate. I took a careful step closer, aware of every subtle movement. The slight tilt of her head, the way her breath caught when our eyes met, the soft rise and fall of her chest as she steadied herself. Slowly, almost reverently, I lifted a hand toward her face. My fingers hovered for a moment, tracing the curve of her cheek, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. She closed her eyes, leaning in slightly, as if the gentle touch grounded her in a way she hadn't realized she needed. The warmth of her skin, the softness of her hair, and the faint scent of her perfume, a mix of jasmine and something subtle, comforting, made my chest tighten with an emotion I struggled to name. I stepped closer, careful not to rush, and our foreheads met lightly. The contact was brief, yet it carried a weight that words could never capture. I could feel the slight tremor in her shoulders, the quiet, almost imperceptible shiver that passed through her as she leaned into the closeness. Her fingers found the fabric of my shirt, curling gently as if anchoring herself, and I didn't move. I let her guide the intimacy, letting her trust me with the space between us. We stood there for several minutes, silent, listening to each other's breathing, the subtle shift of weight, the heartbeat that could be felt more than heard. There was no rush, no need for words or gestures beyond the small, deliberate touches. Every brush of skin against skin, every fleeting pressure of her hands against my arms, was a declaration in itself. She finally spoke, her voice low and hesitant. I haven't let anyone this close in years. The words were simple, but they were loaded with vulnerability, a confession that made my chest ache with tenderness. I'm not going anywhere, I whispered, letting my hand rest lightly on the small of her back. "Not unless you ask me to." Her sigh was soft, almost a release of tension she hadn't realized she was holding. She pressed closer, just enough to feel the warmth of my body, but not so close as to break the fragile, carefully nurtured rhythm between us. Our embrace was slow, intentional, filled with a quiet intensity that neither of us wanted to rush. We stayed like that for a long moment, two people suspended in a delicate balance of trust and desire. There were no expectations, no pressure, just the honest, unguarded closeness that had been building between us from the very beginning. Her fingers traced small, careful patterns along my arms, and I responded with equally gentle touches, savoring the unspoken communication that passed between us. For the first time, it felt real, safe, and yet thrilling in a way that left us both slightly breathless. That night, the world shrank to the space between us, and in that space, everything we had been hesitant to admit suddenly felt possible. The morning light spilled softly through the windows of our building, turning the hallway into a warm wash of gold. I was leaning against my doorframe, savoring the quiet hum of the waking city, when I saw her, standing in her doorway, hair loose and slightly tousled, wearing a calm, open expression that made my chest tighten. She wasn't rushing, wasn't fidgeting. She was just there, present. She smiled as I approached, and it was the kind of smile that carried a quiet relief, a soft acknowledgement that everything we'd been dancing around for weeks had finally found a fragile clarity. "Good morning," she said simply, her voice warm, easy, and unguarded. "Morning?" I replied, trying to match the calmness in her tone, though my heart was doing somersaults. For a moment, we just stood there, the space between us charged with the history of every brush of hands, every lingering glance, every subtle, slow-burn moment that had built up to this day. Neither of us needed words, the connection was already there, palpable and undeniable. Finally, she took a careful step closer, closing the small gap between us. Her fingers reached for mine instinctively, intertwining softly, naturally, as though they had always belonged together. The warmth of her hand in mine grounded me, a tactile confirmation that we were no longer merely neighbors, but something infinitely more tender and complicated. We walked together to the cafe around the corner, fingers still loosely intertwined, every movement deliberate yet unhurried. The city was waking around us, people bustling past, but none of it mattered. There was only the quiet, steady rhythm we were creating together. Every laugh she shared, every soft glance, felt like a promise. A beginning built on trust, vulnerability, and careful patience. Over coffee, we spoke honestly, about what we wanted, about the fears that had kept us apart, and about the slow, tentative hope we had both been holding on to. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic declarations, just honesty, quiet and unwavering, and the kind of mutual understanding that can only form when two people have let down every protective wall they once held up. She leaned her head lightly against my shoulder as we left the cafe, and I didn't move or speak. I simply let her stay there, savoring the quiet intimacy of her presence. The warmth, the subtle scent of her hair, the rhythm of her breathing against mine. All of it told me everything I needed to know. We paused at the corner, sunlight catching her hair just so, and I whispered, "I want to be with you." Slowly, carefully, fully. "If you want that too." Her smile widened softly, eyes glimmering with the same mixture of relief and joy that I felt. "I do," she said, almost breathlessly, and it was enough. The word carried trust, desire, and the acknowledgement of every shared heartbeat that had led us here. As we walked down the street, hand in hand, the world felt gentler, brighter, safer. The slow-burn tension, the hesitation, the subtle longing, it had all culminated in this quiet certainty. Together, we had found our rhythm, our closeness, and the unspoken understanding that this was only the beginning. And in that simple, unhurried touch, fingers entwined, shoulders brushing, foreheads occasionally leaning together, I realized that closeness was more than proximity. It was trust, vulnerability, and the courage to let someone in. And for the first time in a long while, I felt completely at home. If this slow burn story of unexpected closeness and quiet longing touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more age gap romance tales that pull at the heart. And let me know in the comments. Have you ever felt a connection that caught you completely off guard?